So I was asked here on YouTube, how are narcissists created? So narcissistic personality disorder. Here's my theory. Um, what I believe is that narcissistic personality disorder is a disorder that involves the disruption of the formation of a normal human personality. And how I believe this happens is very early childhood trauma. And so when you take a look at babies, infants, and toddlers of a very young age. This is an age where these these children, they don't have a developed sense of self. That their emotional framework is really very rudimentary. It's basically just to get their needs met by the mother. And so they cry and they smile and they giggle and they act out in ways that either impact the mother to get attention and get their needs met, or to even reward the mother with appearing happy, or sort of having like a positive effect on the mother, like a reward, right? It's like positive reinforcement. It creates an experience of bonding for the mother. And so what ends up happening, in my view, is that, if you look at a toddler or an infant, like they're absolutely helpless. Like they are not developed in any way cognitively. Like you have to childproof a house for a reason. It's because these children, like little toddlers running around, like they're just beings. Like they don't really even have any awareness of any distinction between themselves and the outside world. They have no perception of danger. They have no understanding of the implications of engaging this outside world. They are just eyes and ears open, taking in all the light, all the sound, just barely differentiating objects, patterns, shapes, and things like that. And so their mind is just starting to develop, and they haven't even distinguished and differentiated their own self from the outside world. And in that context, they experience the outside world through the mother, through the parents, even. And like you see him running around, and the mother will have to chase him and grab them and keep them. Like I was watching a child today at the gym, and like a lady came in with her little tiny little toddler, I mean barely just walking, and there he just took off, and he was just buzzing around giggling, and he ran behind the back desk and ran over there and ran over there. And so there's no real morality, there's no danger, there's no nothing. It's just blissful being, just running on overdrive, right? Curious, touching things, engaging things, tasting things, putting them in their mouth. It's essentially, pattern recognition and activating all of that. Well, the role of the mother is to keep it safe and to protect it from the outside world, to simply, shepherd the child during this period of time and make sure its needs are met and to keep it safe. Well, what happens if that mother or the father were to abuse that child? It were to do something, knock something over, and you scream at it, you yell, you spank it, you punish it severely. What happens if it's in an environment like that, where the person or the people that are supposed to care for it not only sometimes are inattentive or punitive or abusive? Well, if you traumatize that child, you're introducing a stimulus way prematurely. Like if you scream and yell and punish and invalidate, they have no cognitive capacity to even interpret such an event, that they could have their first fight or flight reaction, just an extreme amount of fear, an extreme amount of pain and suffering, and not really have any cognitive awareness of what is going on. And so essentially what you've done is you've created a relationship to the world, the world outside of themselves, and constituted as one of fear and pain. And so this can be very disruptive to development, that what happens to their emotional pathways, what happens to that internal emotional environment that was just free, that was just exploring, that has very rudimentary emotional experiences available. And then you activate all of that suffering without even any cognitive associations, without any behaviors that they could ever attribute to it, without any understanding. It's just a disruptive, formless emotional experience that could be so horrific. What would have to happen within the psychology of this individual is potentially some form of dissociation, something. But nonetheless, this has generated a relationship to the outside world, to other people. And now what happens is that as you fast forward later, there is a period of time in the human experience where we start to differentiate from an external world. And we start to enter a period of personality development. In my view, personalities are developed in part by originating moments of trauma where a child will experience needing to transition from a free being to one with a personality construct introduced in order to inform and create patterns of behavior. And how this happens is that the child will have originating moments starting in early childhood where they begin to form a personality based on the first experiences of what we would call trauma, where something happened, like that baby or that younger child, 4, 5, 3, 4, running around, and something happens. They knock over one of their mom's planters. And the mom's like, oh no, ah. And the little child freezes. And for the first time, they have a little trigger response, like, uh-oh, something's wrong here. And then based on their interpretation of the circumstances and in looking at the mother, they will realize, uh-oh, something's wrong with me. This will be the first of several experiences where the child experiences a failure to be, meaning that just being no longer works. That they were just being, and then it was not enough. It wasn't right for the situation. And so they will use words. They will interpret the circumstances, and they will deduce their first notion of self. That might be like, I'm not enough. I'm not good enough. Or I'm bad. Just based on an interpretation. It could be based on things that were said or otherwise. And then based on what had happened, they will come up with a compensatory way to be. I've got to be careful. And so moving forward, anytime they're in the perception of a situation where they may, do something similar, they will go, oh, I got to be careful. Or if they had a later experience of feeling weak and they had to be strong. And so anytime something threatens them, they will become strong to avoid the experience of weakness. Or later in life, they experienced a challenge in the classroom. They got an answer wrong socially, raised their hand. It was embarrassing. They felt stupid. And in their imagination, I'm going to figure it out. Like they'll never feel stupid again. Like they said, I'm stupid. I've got to figure it out. And so they created a way of being that would be analytical. It could be in relationship to a group where they experience a failure to belong. They're not enough. I'll be funny. And so funny might be a way in which they engage socially. And so these compensatory ways of being are associated with original moments of trauma where through interpretation of a shortcoming or failure to be enough, the child will assign ways of existing or acting that would fix this problem in this interpreted circumstance. And moving forward through life, these bundles of ways of responding to reality also become the basis of the way we interpret reality. And that creates some measure of permanence around these personality traits, is that we'll continually to interpret reality in such a way that occurs in our conscious mind as mandating us to be a certain way as a response to life. And that's what provides consistency with people's personality over time, that you will continue to operate and think in similar patterns based on similar patterns of interpretation that seem to derive from our past. That said, when a child has been traumatized before this process is to take place, they will not have the same response to those same events. They can cognitively learn how to emulate behaviors and mold themselves through observation and through direction, but they will not have any permanence with their identity. Instead, they will form a false self, a version of a makeshift reality that gives rise to a reflected being. And so they have to emulate, because they don't even develop emotionally past that original trauma state. And so they do not participate normally in the formation or genesis of identity or personality. And the other feature is that that emotional level of maturity or development keeps them in a narcissistic state, because young children only exist to get their own needs met. And while this human being can develop cognitively, maybe even understanding the implications of the needs of others, their external behaviors are merely generated as to experience themselves through the engagement with other people, because they do not develop identity permanence. This makeshift identity that they've created requires ongoing engagement with other people as to maintain it in the experience of a being who's arrested in emotional development state, where they only experienced their own existence through the gaze of others, particularly their mother. And so because children at that age don't experience an individual self, it's as if the narcissist requires emotional engagement and acknowledgement that validates and verifies the existence of the false self. And so the reason for ongoing need of narcissistic supply is because narcissists lack permanence around a personality that would be rooted in memory, that they didn't develop that way of consistently being. And so they operate like chameleons in a way, that they have a certain measure of flexibility, because they are, in a sense, the authors of the reality they live within. And ultimately, this makeshift being's main primary role is to get supply and to prevent narcissistic injury or collapse. That their internal emotional environment is unlike a matured one that has all those other emotional states available to it. They have no capacity for empathy because their internal emotional environment has been damaged. It has been dysregulated. It has been filled with hyper-developed, experiences of suffering that are formless and do not have any cognitions associated with them, that those pathways were prematurely activated through original trauma and matured and cemented. And the other, neuronal pathways that would cause the other emotions to be experienced are unavailable. That there's been a permanent structural alteration within the brain as well, because those other pathways were never activated. They were never matured. They don't exist. And so the internal emotional environment of somebody with narcissistic personality disorder is something that they have to prevent themselves from experiencing. And that would be the purpose of the false self. That the false self including the false reality that houses the false self, that becomes a reflected being off of an interpreted reality that they have to conspire or manufacture, is a coping mechanism, to prevent narc injury, to prevent mortification, and also to garner supply. And so they maintain and retain the original emotional structure of an infant while also having an internal emotional environment that is completely dysregulated and that is to be avoided at all costs. That the truth would just be, essentially acknowledging the distinction between an objective reality and the reality of the narcissist. And anything that threatens their false reality threatens the being within that reality, therefore is perceived as an existential threat to that being that is there to protect this experienced human from ever, being present to that internal trauma environment. And that's why these people end up the way that they are, is that, they don't experience love. They only experience love as the positive affect of the supply of somebody. That your supply is what makes them feel love, because ultimately it makes them feel good. That you're this perfect idealized being, and you go along with their idealized reality. They get good supply off of the positive treatment that you have for them or for other people have. But ultimately, that they only exist for their own needs to be met, because that's basically the way that their emotional mind works. They do not have empathy because they don't have access to the emotions that would enable the recreation of the experience of other people. They project on other people because we all project as a way to understand other people. The problem is that the projections from narcissists are only informed by the emotions that they have access to. And so their own emotional state or their own ways of experiencing reality become projected onto others. That if you've ever noticed with any narcissist, their current moods or whatever they're feeling ends up being what they would assert you feel or how they would understand you. It's because they don't have the capacity for empathy, because they have undeveloped minds. And so in my view, narcissistic personality disorder is, a result of very early childhood trauma and abuse. That, traumatizing, screaming at, hitting, punishing, hurting children that have not in any way cognitively developed or differentiated from other or even experienced themselves as a self is what would cause a complete disruption emotionally, and it would, eliminate their capacity to develop a personality. That they were already traumatized before those original moments could happen. And so the structures of personality that would give permanence in terms of identity, as well as the process of differentiation of self. And so I think what they will retain is a constant need to emotionally engage other people to verify, validate, and experience the existence of this false entity. And that's the only purpose in which they exist, that everything is about supply. And all of the behaviors are learned. They're cognitive processes of attempting to emulate behaviors and expressions that would normally in other people be guided by real emotion. In the case of the narcissist, it's not. And I would think that many of them don't even know the difference. That they just act out a life with all these different patterns of behavior and acting. And in reality, they're very much emotionally rudimentary with a basic emotional structure of a toddler. And then at the same time, their emotional internal environment is so dysregulated and so destroyed and so traumatized that it remains that way. something that could never be transformed because it was generated in a domain of formlessness with no cognitive connections, meaning like it wasn't based on punishment or failure. It was just an arbitrary activation of all of that pain and suffering that essentially stimulated these emotional pathways in the mind premature. And then that would later play a role in an inability to form a personality based on not being able to exist merely as a being and experience a shortcoming of being because they are no longer operating in the same space of being that would be necessary for those original moments to be generated. They've already got a fear-based reality that they're not going to experience the capacity to develop a personality because they're already suspended in a narcissistic trauma state while other children are not. And so I think that that's pretty much what has happened to these people is they got traumatized early. They never developed a personality. They exist as a projected false self that is merely existent to meet its own needs, which would be supply and survival. And that is it. And so they cannot form meaningful connections, and they can't even really see or interpret intact people because they're missing all the dimensions that would enable them to empathize.